This is
Make it plain.
Make it plain.
MIP
With Masamela Matfumo.
Mark Thompson.
Make it plain.
Get woke.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Thursday of Indictment Week. God bless you. We welcome you to another edition of
Another indictment.
another Indictment Week. Indictment Week number 4 or 5. We can't even keep up with all of it. There's so many of them happening. Markos is back with us always. Markos Melissa is the founder of Daily Kos, the largest online progressive community, and a very important part of our news and journalism. News you can do something about is what we like to call it. Founder of Civics with a Q, host of the ever-popular podcast, The Brief. Buddy, how are you on this latest Indictment Week? It finally happened. And
it's so good, Mark. It's so good.
Well, let me just get your reaction to the indictment and the RICO and all of this. And I learned, did you know, seems like we got some bad information. I mean, the collective we. Because people were talking about the possibility of a Kemp pardon. But then as soon as this happened, the news broke that the governor of Georgia really doesn't have pardon power like that. So,
No.
but people I remember a few weeks ago, people were saying that. I was in a whole conversation about that. So that's good news. But what are your thoughts about this? And this looks like a dog that will certainly hunt.
For sure. There's a couple of reasons this indictment is so incredibly important, and maybe more so than the federal ones. One of them is, like you say, there's no pardon, and the Georgia legislature right now is trying to change that. They're trying to rush a governor pardon bill. I don't know if Kemp would sign it. Remember, Trump went after Kemp. Even if Kemp had the power, why would Kemp pardon Trump? I mean, Trump went hard after Kemp, hard. And the fact that it was those swingy, suburban, college-educated white voters that saved Kemp, because everywhere else, Trump was successful in defeating anybody that challenged the orthodoxy that the election was stolen. And Kemp and Raffensperger, the Secretary of State in Georgia, they actually bucked that trend, and it's because of those swingy suburban voters that are still registered Republican, which is why Stacey Abrams wasn't able to win in the general election, but Raphael Warnock was, because those swing voters swung, and they don't like Trumpism, just like anywhere else in the country. So the lack of pardon is important, but almost even more so, the RICO statute is actually kind of remarkable for two reasons. One, it is a very easy standard to meet. Basically, you have to prove a group of people conspired to commit 2 crimes. The indictment, I think, has 130 potential crimes. I think that's what the number was. And so it's like a pick your menu. Here's a buffet. Just pick 2 and you got it. You got that RICO conviction. And there's actually arguments that RICO convictions are too easy from a justice perspective. But in this case, it does not play well for Trump. And the second reason the RICO statute is critical is because it carries a mandatory 5-year minimum sentence. And so there was some suggestion that maybe a judge can do parole. The DA, the Fulton County DA, Fannie Willis, said that wasn't true, that it actually carried, that it wasn't parole, that it actually meant you had to serve time. He may actually serve time, and there may not, it's not a question of a judge. In the federal cases, judges, I almost guarantee he's not going to serve jail time, right? They're just not going to do it. But in this case, if it's a mandatory, it's out of the hands of the judge, then great. Now, does that mean Trump would serve 5 years? Not necessarily. Obviously, there's parole and whatnot, right? But I just want him to serve 1 day in jail. That would make me so freaking happy. And so it is an incredibly impactful act. And if I'm Trump, I'm freaking out. And it sucked in so many of his co-conspirators. And I don't think we're done seeing more names come out. I think this is the first batch. So a lot of those unindicted co-conspirators, unless we're singing right now, may find themselves also in the firing line. So these are the worst people, and they don't deserve anything less. And I'm glad that Georgia's moving forward, and it's actually emboldening similar investigations in Arizona and in Michigan, where Democrats now hold those offices. The on the DA side, right? The investigative offices.
Somebody's going to jail. Somebody's got to. When you have that many charges, that many people, someone is going to jail. We've waited on this. It finally happened. And this one has a lot of teeth, folks. Is this the one that breaks down any barrier for whomever's remaining that is on the fence, and I don't know if he's really wrong, and I don't know if our democracy is really in jeopardy? We've talked about these being the two biggest issues, Dobbs versus LaRoe, and this one, the issue of democracy. Yeah. Do you think this is the one, or will it more so become the one if we can get some actual evidence and testimony before the public between now and November 2024?
Oh, Mark, that's a third point that I forgot to mention, is that there are going to be cameras in the newsroom, in a courtroom, which is not the case in the federal cases. I mean, this is so different than those federal ones, and not to discount the federal ones. Those are critically important, and hope to see a lot of convictions there. But we're actually going to see this, and Trump's not going to be able to help himself. He's going to try to grandstand, and he's going to dig himself the bigger hole. Like this is it's going to be a thing. Does this mean there's nobody on the sidelines right now? Right now we're so polarized politically that there's nobody who's going to change their mind now, realizing now, if the Republican primary field was smart, they would all start beating the crap out of Donald Trump, because there's a phenomenon. And Mark, you know, any of us who have tracked primaries in the past know that this is true. In every primary, like, all the top candidates have their moment in the sun, right? They rise to the top of the polls, and then what happens is all the other candidates gang up on that one person, and they get knocked down. Howard Dean, Wesley Clark, Bernie Sanders had his moment. Herman Cain, I think, had his moment. When one of the times he ran for president. Jeb Bush had his moment. Fred Thompson, you have these ups, and then everybody beats up on them. Why won't they do that with Donald Trump? Like, are they really running for president? Like, other than Chris Christie, and then you had Mike Pence mildly criticize Trump. Why aren't they beating the crap out of him? If they all did, it would create a narrative, and people respond to that repetition. But they won't do it. They won't do it with Trump, and they're still absolutely paranoid. They're afraid. They wouldn't touch him. Can you imagine, when Elizabeth Warren had her moment, or when Howard Dean had her moment, if the other Democrats would be like, "Ooh, we better not criticize him because the left is going to be angry." Like, this is what they're thinking. Oh, we can't criticize Donald Trump because the MAGA right's going to be angry. Like, it makes no freaking sense. So that's why if we were to see any support chip away, it would have to be from Republicans. And I think anybody that's an anti-Trump Republican isn't an anti-Trump Republican by now. I don't see why they would change. But what it does is, and this is critically important, is it keeps the issue of democracy, just like the issue of abortion, keeps them front and center. And that's motivating Democrats to turn out and vote. And that's the critical issue there. Plus, it's keeping those swingy, college-educated, white suburban voters, mostly women, but I'm starting to see hints of men. It's keeping them in the Democratic column. And like we saw in Georgia, and in Virginia in 2021, they'll swing back to the Republicans the first chance they get.
I have encountered some low information voters of late, though, Markos, who see, and these are even some black voters, who feel like Trump, believe it or not, is being targeted because he's running against Joe Biden. That Joe Biden actually, and people are like, well, and you try to explain that to people, say that's not what's going on. There's a special prosecutor. Joe Biden's not into it. After all, his own son is under investigation. So unfortunately, there are just a number of people out here who are not like us, who sleep, eat, and drink this stuff, which, might speak to, our level of pathology. But whatever it is, people who, like you said, who read people. So that's what I need to ask you, because I'm trying. You suggested that there has to be kind of a gauge. Is this playing in people? I mean, does People Magazine cover this? Are people seeing this, however objectively it's presented, and realize and say, hey, this is not a good thing. This is not somebody we need to return to office. And it's, another piece of evidence has come out: the breach of the Dominion voting system. See, the question then becomes, if they have the ability to do that, why couldn't they do that again?
No, and that, remember, they blamed that on Democrats, right? And it was them that were doing that. Like, it's always projection with those people. Yeah, I mean, their biggest, strongest response to this isn't to defend Donald Trump. It's a claim that it's a political witch hunt, right? And that's going to be that. And it's a First Amendment right, and it's none of those issues. Obviously, I don't think it matters. There are going to be people who are going to think that, and it's going to be fanned by the right wing. And this is exactly what they said during the January 6 hearings in 2022, or remember, early 2022, claiming that those were politically motivated, and that's why it was so important to have Liz Cheney in that committee, because she gave it a veneer. Her and what's his face from Adam Kinzinger from Illinois, because it gave that a veneer of bipartisanship when their argument was that this was a partisan witch hunt, right? Remember, the issue kept the issue of democracy, and it became a winning issue for Democrats. The underlying reality of our elections is that there are more liberals and liberal-leaning people than there are conservatives, and that disparity grows every single year because we age into voting age. Young people are more liberal than we are, Mark. I mean, they're far to our left, and their voters are exiting the electorate. You know, they are dying off. And so what Democrats need to do is get our people out to vote. And this holding Donald Trump accountable is incredibly motivating to getting people out to vote. And when we argue that if Trump is elected, he'll pardon himself and he'll pardon all his co-conspirators, that is incredibly motivating to our side. So yeah, let them argue that it's politically motivated. They're going to convince themselves that it's all a witch hunt, just like they'd still convince themselves that Donald Trump won the election in 2020. It doesn't matter. And one of the things that kind of cracks me up is they keep saying, like, careful if you indict him, you don't know what you're opening, like can of worms you're opening up. And like, what are you going to do? Are you going to have an insurrection? Are you going to occupy the Capitol? Are you going to make up lies? Like, they're already doing the conspiracies. Like, there's nothing more that they can do. It reminds me of what's going on in Ukraine, where people are like, oh, don't anger Russia because they'll escalate. Like, escalate to what? They're already destroying cities and raping and pillaging. Like, there's nothing else they can do. They're not going to drop a nuke. So once somebody has escalated to 100, there's really no more threats. Like, you can't threaten anymore.
Right.
Can't threaten to do what you're already doing.
Right. We've already seen the worst of it. You also wrote a piece I'm curious about as well, where you're showing how Republicans are even suppressing the votes of their own conservative women constituency, right?
Yeah.
Talk to us about that, if you would.
Yeah, there is what we've seen with Republicans in the last decade, 2-3 decades, is that when a voting group turns against them, they don't sit there and try to think, how do we get this group back, right? So if young people start voting against them, they try to suppress the vote in college campuses. Like, that's their response. If Black people are voting against them, they make it harder to vote in urban centers. So you have to stand in line for 8 hours. While if you're white in suburbia, you stand in line for 5 minutes. And so this is the way they're doing. And so now they're realizing that they've lost the woman vote. I mean, they're getting, they lose it, between 10 and 20 points each election, and more women vote than men. And, it's about 53% of women, of the voting pool, it's like 53% women, 47% men. So again, that gives them even more power. So instead of saying like, all right, what are we doing wrong and how can we do better to win back the woman vote? What they're doing now is there's this whole new push to literally roll back universal suffrage, is to deny women the right to vote. And they do that both on, they claim it's historical, like the founding fathers were wise and they knew, better, and they didn't give women the right to vote. And then also on religious grounds, that the Bible says that men should be making all the decisions. And of course, how they pick this Bible verse or that Bible verse to supposedly support their bigotry. And what's it was just funny that they're actually, at least I picked out there's a whole viral tweet and a big storm on the right wing Twitter space where they were arguing over. This woman said, "Yeah, my husband doesn't want me to vote because the Bible says the man is in charge," and people were freaking out about that, and for real reason. Like conservatives were freaking out about that for a real reason, right? But that's if you're going to be consistent in those beliefs that say that women should not have the right to vote, then yeah, conservative women shouldn't have the right to vote. And it's so absurd that we had women Republican candidates making those arguments, and Coulter has made that argument. She literally says she would give up her right to vote if all the women couldn't vote. I mean, what is that? Can you imagine a liberal making any kind of analogous argument? I can't even imagine what that might look like. It's crazy.
You cite one tweet from a woman on Twitter at Reformed Logic 1. She wrote August 7th, 2.9 million views, folks, of what she posted. "I asked my husband if he wanted me to vote this year. He said going forward, he doesn't want me to vote, and I couldn't be more relieved. I truly think things like voting in law enforcement should be reserved for men only." Obviously, that's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but what she's saying. But yeah, I mean, I don't get there. Again, I don't think they know how to do math. Their math doesn't math. You need that. So you're going to tell your population, women, not to vote when you actually need their numbers to win an election.
Yeah. It's beyond self-defeating. I mean, you can suppress the vote of college students. You can suppress urban vote. There's ways to do that. You can clear out the voter rolls of accidentally unregistered people to vote. Like there's ways you can suppress the vote that make mathematical sense. Nobody's going to eliminate a woman's right to vote. It's just not going to happen. So why even talk about something like that? Like I would not come out and say, "Mark, we need to remove the ability of rural voters to vote," and then make a thing out of it. Like you're alienating rural voters for something that is never going to happen. It is so freaking weird that I can't even, but their bigotry runs so deep. Their sense of entitlement and frustrations and grievances that they will say things that are utterly self-defeating with no upside whatsoever. I mean, the other option is you actually have policies that you stand for and you try to win people by convincing them, but God forbid they try to do that.
Yeah. Trump's got a new word too, folks, as a result of this indictment. He's looking for the riggers. Who are the riggers? Now, if y'all don't get the code in that, I don't know what else to tell you, but we know what that is. He attacks Fonnie Willis, and then he starts talking about riggers. We got to stop the riggers. So y'all be clear about what he's doing there and take.
Oh, Mark, can you imagine how Trump feels having a black woman have this much power over him and refusing to call him President Trump, calling him Mr. Donald Trump? Like it's freaking, he's gonna lose his mind. He can't help himself.
3 black women. You've got Tish Graves here in New York.
Oh yeah.
Attorney General.
Oh my God.
You got the woman judge in Washington D.C. I'm sorry I don't have her name right now.
I can't remember her name. No, you're right. 3 black women had power over him, and he's He's not going to be able to help it. I mean, he already can't help himself, and there's going to be all sorts of orders where you can't threaten. He's going to break them, and one of these judges is going to finally put him in jail for contempt.
Yeah, finally. And the one in Tanya Chutkin, that's her name. She doesn't play. In fact, I understand she was pretty harsh.
Yeah, she was the Mr. Donald Trump, right? When he was upset, they were upset that they weren't calling him president.
Right, Mr. Trump. Like, no. She was pretty harsh on some January 6th defendants and their sentencing. And somebody just told me yesterday that in one of the cases, a jury in D.C. actually felt a little sorry for this particular January 6th defendant because she was so hard on him. They said guilty, but they were like, "Oh, you little rough woman, what you gonna give him the electric chair?" But that's how they say she's a lawyer. A lawyer told me that yesterday offline. It's like, you need to know this. I said, really? And some of the jurors were diverse. They were like, "Ooh, you rough," but
awesome.
So this is he really ought to be careful about that. Okay, one thing I want to do before we go, because we've not actually talked about Ukraine at some point, and obviously one piece here I'm very curious about, where you're talking about Russia's destabilizing efforts in Africa sparking a regional war. What's going on there, Markos?
So there has been a series of Russia and Wagner mercenary-backed coups in several of those countries, Burkina Faso and Ivory Coast. No, not Ivory Coast. Burkina Faso, Niger. Just recently, it's the big one. And in Niger, it's military junta took over a couple of weeks ago, and so there is an organization of West African states that are putting together a military intervention force that may or may not, who knows, we'll see, but is threatening to invade Niger to bring back the democratically elected leader of that country. And so you're having this, and this is just in this West African country, corner of the continent. You have you have Russia pretty much operating throughout the whole continent. Their West is trying to be hands off, just because there's a colonial past, right? So any hint of European or American, quote, meddling is seen very, very harshly. And Russia really has gotten very good at jumping on that rhetoric and sort of fueling this idea that they are anti-imperialists and they're defenders of Africa's right to self-determination. But what they're doing is they're putting together, they're supporting, all of them are despotic, military, autocratic, repressive regimes. And then Wagner comes in, and then they get the mineral rights to offer that, those dictators security. And that's where Prigozhin, the Wagner chief, had all his money to fund, their part of the war in Ukraine. So it's a very sensitive, very delicate situation. It really does feel like the West, hands are tied behind their backs. They really can't engage aggressively because, again, it's that colonial history, and it's a shameful. I mean, we can just stipulate that the West has been god awful on Africa, and so they don't have any moral high ground to come in and say, like, don't you see what the Russians are doing? Like, they're doing the same shit we did back in the day, and they're just just them versus us. But so it's just tough, and in underlying all of that, there's a massive Islamic uprising in all of northern Africa. Basically, it's ISIS offshoots, and we've seen some of these people in the past. Boko Haram, who would go into girls' schools and just murder all the girls because they were learning. It's a serious danger to the region. Both France and the United States have major military bases in Niger, so it also complicates that because it's probably in their interest to make nice with the new ruling coup leaders to keep those it's basically drones, to keep those drones flying against those Islamic terrorists. They are legitimately terrorists. But it's just but Africa, Russia, Russia thrives on that kind of chaos. I think Russia's perfectly happy to see the ISIS help to stabilize those countries, because then it makes it easier for them to come in with Wagner and overthrow governments that will then hand them all those mineral rights. And it is in a lot of ways related to the war in Ukraine, and it is related to this expansionist, colonial, imperialist Russia. And really, again, it's like right wingers, right? They love to accuse others of doing what they themselves are doing. So it's incredibly unfortunate. And honestly, Africa does not deserve it. Their country's suffered enough.
Yeah, no, it's no question. It don't deserve it. And it's really a catch-22 because the African people don't want the West to help because they've been no good as well.
No, it's been awful.
And so Russia is exploiting that. I'm wondering though, what do Russia and the mercenaries, Wagner, what do they get out of this though?
So Wagner gets mineral rights. So that region, like most of Africa, is rich in natural resources and diamonds, gold, rare earth minerals. I mean, a lot of that stuff. And so they're extracting billions of dollars from Africa in just mineral wealth. And that's actually helping prop up the Russian economy when otherwise it's under heavy sanctions. So there's that. Second of all, it's pushing the West. There's this whole movement that Russia has been leading, Russia and China, to create a, quote, sort of multipolar world. Right now, the idea is that the world is dominated by Western hegemony. Hegemony is how you say it.
Hegemony, yeah.
Which is basically United States and Europe, right? And that it's a colonial view of the world and it's exploitative view of the world. And so what the world needs is a counterbalance to that Western dominance so that the West can't just exploit the rest of the world. And of course, you feed on a lot of actual Western exploitation, right? That's the challenge, right? Because it's easy to make that argument because the West has a long history of exploiting the rest of the world. And the reality is that, and so there's an organization called BRICS, and it stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And they are supposedly sort of the centerpiece of this new global coalition of what they call the Global South. Now, it's ironic that only South Africa is actually, and Brazil are Global South in that. But the Global South are these rising countries that emerging economies that maybe are being held down or being exploited by the West. And so they also deserve to have a say and role in how the world is governed. Now, it turns out that most of the countries that are interested in BRICS are kind of like Russia and China, are despotic dictatorships. Not all of them. India is the world's largest democracy. Brazil's democracies. But a lot of the people that are looking to join, it's becoming sort of a club for dictators in a lot of ways. Now, BRICS itself is a bit of a mess. China and India are literally shooting at each other across the border. They all want, Russia wants a common currency, but nobody's going to agree to to go with the ruble. I mean, it's and China is so dominant economically over the rest of that bloc that they have no interest in subsuming their national interest for like the common good. And China's famously unitarian in how they approach the world policies. They have no allies. They literally there's not a China alliance with anybody. North Korea, they're friendly with, but just out of convenience because it's the buffer with South Korea and American forces there. And other than that, they're fighting with all their neighbors, right? They don't have a single friend anywhere. And so BRICS is not necessarily, it's in itself is a threat to Western dominance, because it's really about money. Now, the BRICS nations are a third of the world's population, right? India, China are massive, just those two by themselves. And Indonesia wants to join. It's one of the largest countries in the world. And so there's a very real possibility that in a few years, BRICS might actually have 9 of the top 10 most populated countries. But if you look at economies, the whole different stuff, you have tiny Netherlands has a bigger economy than India. So it's economically, the West is just dominant. And what happened is there's a BRICS summit happening next week, actually, in South Africa, and Putin wanted to attend, and but he can't because he's indicted at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And so South Africa, for a while, they actually talked about maybe pulling out of that treaty, because by treaty they're required to arrest him if he shows up. And the backlash was so fierce, and not even the threat that Americans and European companies would pull back from South Africa, just the threat of it led South Africa to back down. So when you talk about sort of the influence of the West, it's not even strong power. It's that sort of soft economic power where you can't afford to piss off Europeans and American business interests. Nothing to do with the political, with those business interests. So this idea that the global South will create a counterbalance to American and European power. I mean, I'm not going to say it's not going to happen eventually. I mean, world history suggests it will. But I mean, it's not a thing that's happening now. But that's a lot of what's driving Russia's efforts in Africa, is to pry away those governments that are pro-West and put them into the Russia sphere of that divide.
And I get to South Africa because I've debated some OGs in the movement who go way back, and who still.
Yeah, the West supported apartheid, and the Russians supported
right. That's
the African National Congress, right?
And Angola, and
same thing.
What happened with Cuba, and Cuba supported the anti-apartheid movement. But I tell people, I'd remind of somebody, that wasn't Russia. That wasn't this Russia. That was the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And for whatever you want to say about them and their issues, they did do that. That's a matter of record. That's not in dispute. But this is something very, very different, and we need to always be prudent about checking the motives. And unfortunately, that's one of the, the only thing as bad, if not worse than enslavement, was colonialism. And so all of our African nations are still struggling to come back from that. With Africa, as populous as it is, ought to be in a position to do anything it wants to do, control its own resources, have its own currency, and it's not allowed to do that. So everybody's still kind of messing with it, including Russia. None of Russia's business. It's none of Russia's business. So at one time when I remember watching some old film, and Kennedy was having a press conference when he was president, and all the stuff was coming up, what had happened to Patrice Lumumba. And someone asked Kennedy in the press conference, and I guess back in those days, this was a risque thing to say, President Kennedy, do you believe Africa should be for the Africans? And he said, well, who else would it be for? Yeah. And again, which kind of demonstrated he was somebody who was going to try to keep going in another direction anyway. They couldn't have that, right? And you could tell when he said, it was like a gasp in the room. Yeah. He said, who else would it be for? If it's not for them?
It's almost a stupid question. It's so freaking obvious. And the colonial undertones of it.
Right. So yeah, this I was that piqued my curiosity in terms of what's going on there, and I've said to people, whatever the Soviet Union was, this is an oligarchy. So he is a representative of an oligarchy. This is the Russian mob. All right. So is this who you want calling the shots in Africa? People who still pine for, and not to mention Wagner. I mean, what sounds more German than that? Anyway.
There's and Wagner was a famous white supremacist, by the way. He provided a lot of the intellectual foundation for Nazism.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
I mean, this is that's not an accident.
And we're saying it wrong. Wagner. That's what it is. We know what it is.
Yeah, and there's this. I've been paying attention to Africa in a way that I haven't probably ever. And there is a strain of nationalism that says, all you outsiders, stop taking our resources, build the facilities, the factories to use those resources here in our countries. That sounds, fight for that. That's not what Russia's doing, though. Russia's literally replacing itself, but they're providing protection which is what the Europeans did, right? They provided protection for certain governments in exchange for extraction of resources. Now Russia's they're just filling in and doing the exact same thing. And if anybody calls them out, they'll scream about Western imperialism. And unfortunately, it lands because, yes, Western imperialism was and is a thing in the continent of Africa. And ideally, yes, you would build those factories, you'd build that economic foundation so Africa could actually develop its own resources and develop its own society in advance, because the resources are, I mean, it's a rich continent.
Right.
But that's what makes it so appealing to everybody else, every other colonial power wants their hands on those riches.
That's right. That's right. And folks, the resources that we're using now, most of the resources we use now are affected by or solely dependent upon mineral resources that come out of Africa. Our cell phones, the batteries in our laptops, cell phones, all that, it comes from a mineral called coltan, which has now become a conflict mineral in Africa. Africans aren't making any money off of that. Yeah. Okay, so that's what it's all about. So check that out too. There's also at Coast, as well as, Markos is still giving us a regular reporting on what's going on in Ukraine. I don't think anybody in the mainstream is barely talking about Ukraine much anymore.
No, our coverage is freaking fantastic.
It is.
Like, I am so proud of our coverage. Yeah.
You all does being progressive disqualify Daily Kos from being eligible for a Pulitzer?
Probably.
We should test that though. We should test balloon that. Just see, it don't hurt. Just, W.B. Du Bois said, Markos, that sometimes it's still good to fight even if you lose. So the people will at least see there was blood on the ground and you tried.
Yeah, I like that.
Let's go to the Pulitzer committee. No, because nobody's been doing that. You don't hear about it at all anymore. And now it's wall to wall Trump. I pitched a story to, I won't name it, a news agency. And he said, Mark, we don't want to do that because right now all we want to talk about is indictment. I was like, okay, I get that, but this is like 2 weeks out. So you might, there's no, this is 2 weeks from now.
Nope, indictment till election day. Although I wouldn't mind if that was all they talked about until election day. That would not be the worst.
I just trying to squeeze, it's a sound. I was just trying to squeeze 30 seconds, man. 30 seconds on something.
I know we're running out of time. Let me tell you a story though. I was at News Nation, we were just there.
Yeah.
And I had a caucus meeting with readers of Daily Kos. And so there's about 40, 50 of us in a room. And somebody said, Markos, why don't you write more positive stories about Democrats? Why is it always Trump, Trump, Trump? And I was like, no, we write positive stories about Democrats. Just let me talk today. Here's a story about Joe Biden passing a new student debt relief initiative. And then here's another story about candidates running against Ted Cruz in Texas. And Joe Biden. And we talked about that for about 30 seconds. And then I said, yeah, but the problem is that Donald Trump looms large. And I think I said something just like that. And for 30 minutes, all people talked about was Donald Trump. And so at like about 20, 30 minutes, I said, okay, hold on, guys. That's why people write about Donald Trump. What did you all want to talk about? You didn't want to talk about Joe Biden's student debt relief plan. Like, I teed that up for you. Nobody wanted to talk about that, but just a passing mention of Donald Trump. And you all went to the races. Like, they were all excitedly talking about Trump. So I get it. Like, we definitely at Daily Kos, we try to balance the Trump stuff with all this other news. But Donald Trump is the stuff that drives attention and clicks, and it's tough not to give people what they want. Well, but aside from the financial part, right?
But not only that, but it's not like this news
medium.
I'm
talking
totally
about
get
what you're saying. Yeah,
it's just rote. What at least what Daily Kos is doing, as I said, this is not just hyperbole, folks. News you can do something about. So they're also, you can be a journalist, but also provide information for people to respond, react better. The situation, and that's what Daily Kos is doing. And that's one reason we ask all of you to support it. DailyKos.com.
Yes, in any case, you need to get your story. I'm sure it's Trump isn't the only story, and that's the challenge, right? And we definitely don't make it the only story, and that's a problem when Trump owns all the narrative.
He does, and we need to. I mean, it's developed. it's almost become for some a codependency.
Yeah.
And that's unhealthy. So we got to do something. Codependency isn't healthy, folks. Civicswithaq.com, the podcast, The Brief, dailycoast.com, another edition of Thursday Coast in the books on yet another indictment week. Does the special prosecutor, he's not finished yet, I don't think, either. He might have some.
There's secret documents in Bedminster, and you don't add that crime to the Florida one because you have to try in the location of the crime. So there may still be a New Jersey indictment, and then we may still have indictments happening in Arizona and Michigan. So let's not. I don't think we're done, and we may not be done for a while.
Yeah, the rest of us would already be under the jail, folks. Oh. Any one of us was doing this, Markos, me, anybody, most of you listening, under the jail.
Especially owning our own jet that can fly off anytime it wants. Like, yeah, no, hell no.
They have to surrender all of that. But he's still running around and carrying on. So no, this is about accountability. This is about democracy. This is about freedom and justice and equality. It is not about one personality and him just saying, as he's done his whole life. Yeah. That's his problem. If somebody should have checked him earlier, he wouldn't be doing this. But as he has done whatever he has wanted to do with no consequences, no accountability, no pushback. I'm just doing what I want to do. I'm doing it. Yeah. I can't be stopped. Where are the rigors? So
I can shoot somebody on 35th Street or 31st, whatever street it was, and nobody will. Yeah,
nothing's gonna happen.
He told us he doesn't care about the law.
Right, doesn't care about the law. I don't like Chris Christie at all. But we will use him if that's what it takes.
Okay, yeah.
He needs to, and he does not need to buckle or get weak. Chris Christie needs to prosecute this man.
And I will say this, our audience at Daily Coast loves stories about Chris Christie beating up on Donald Trump. That's a story of those media outlets. Instead of just repeating what Donald Trump has tweeted or whatever, socialist. How about write some stories about all the hilarious attacks that Chris Christie have those two bullies going at it. Yep.
Just two bullies. Punch.
Two of the biggest a-holes in the country going at each other. Like, what can go wrong? Like,
that's right.
Cover that story. It's a fun story.
Yeah, and that'll let them take each other out.
Yep.
DailyCoast.com. Thank you, buddy.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for getting woke and listening to Make It Plain. As always, perform an act of kindness on behalf of an elder or young person. Write a letter to a sister brother who just so happens to find her or himself incarcerated. Offer libations to the ancestors upon whose sturdy shoulders we all now stand. And above all, give thanks to the God of your understanding by whatever name you call her and him. All God asks of us is that we give each other love. Thanks for giving MIP love. And please remember to subscribe and give us a 5-star rating. If all hearts and minds are clear, it has been made plain.